Hey CS51 TF, and welcome to my exploration portion of Pset 8. So I'm going to start by running just the normal base case. This has no extensions, it's just this is the way the program runs with my answers to questions 1 through 5. And we'll see the data's over here. I also have it saved right here. But the main thing we're going to want to focus on is the number of people that have died, which in this base case, it's 104. And for my first extension, I wanted to test out the flattened curve version, which is one of the recommended ones in the README file. And basically, once the number of infected people exceeds a certain amount, 120 in this case, as you can see here, then the mortality rate increases. By how much? In this case, it increases 20-fold. And I just did that so the effect would be very noticeable. But it'll have this increased mortality rate actually has some interesting behaviors. And you'll see initially that the mortality rate just skyrockets immediately before plateauing, and then skyrockets again, and then plateaus again. So why is that? Well, that's because initially we must be over this 120 limit that I've set right here. And that causes us to go with the higher mortality rate, the one that's 20 times as large as the normal 2% one. And that causes this steady but large mortality rate. And actually people are dying so quickly that the number of infected people is actually decreasing on net because people are dying faster than new people are getting infected. So this causes the number of infected people to decrease, and it actually falls below this 120 limit, which causes this plateau, because once we're below that 120 limit, we go back to the 2% mortality rate. And that same thing happens on this second peak, which this actually got me thinking about something I learned in a history class, interestingly enough, about the last pandemic. And I'm not talking about COVID, I'm talking about the Spanish flu. Apparently, the Spanish flu was so lethal that it sort of burnt itself out. But basically, it was killing people so quickly that the people were not able to infect others before dying. And so that's what I'm testing right now to see whether a high mortality rate could eradicate the virus or whatever sickness is being caused here. So I've increased, in this case, the mortality rate from 2% to 30%. And this is with the normal base case. This isn't with the flattened curve version, but you'll see immediately that the mortality rate is just constantly increasing, and sort of has this like diminishing returns sort of curve appearance. And you know, this is very reminiscent of what happened with the Spanish flu, because you'll see by the end of it, a lot of people have died. But at the end of the simulation, there's only 2 people that are still infected. So it's not hard to believe that if I let this program run for longer, that the sickness would sort of eradicate itself, which I thought was really interesting. And for the last part of my exploration portion of the Pset, I'm gonna be looking at what happens if I implement a vaccine. The final portion of my Pset, I decided to implement a vaccine in my simulation, and I did so by creating 2 new classes. The first one is shown right here, and it's called Vaccinated. This, as the name suggests, represents a group of people that have gotten the vaccine but are currently not infected, and they are represented in a light blue color in my simulation. The second class that I've implemented is called VacInfect, and they represent the group of people that got infected in spite of getting the vaccine, and they're represented as a green color in my simulation. And you may be asking yourself, why would you create 2 new classes instead of altering previously existing ones? And that's because vaccinated people in the real world and in my simulation behave fundamentally different from unvaccinated people. And we can see that because of the 4 defining characteristics of a vaccinated person. The first one is increased resistance to the virus. No, I said increased resistance, not an outright immunity like the recovered class implements, but a resistance. So here's the part of the code, it's highlighted right now, that calculates whether a person that's been vaccinated is going to get infected or not. And this implementation is nearly identical to the implementation in the susceptible class. The one key difference is in this line right here. This line effectively means that the vaccine is 80% effective, or reduces the probability of you getting infected by 80%. The second key defining characteristic of a vaccinated person is that the status is temporary in the real world and in the simulation. And that's implemented right here. So after a certain amount of time, if you haven't gotten infected, you will lose your vaccinated status and you will become susceptible again. This is reminiscent of having to get a booster shot with like COVID or something. And it may be because the effectiveness of the vaccine wears off, or maybe the virus has mutated and is no longer effective. The vaccine is no longer effective. Now, the second two key defining characteristics are implemented in the vac-infect category. The first one, which interestingly enough, I didn't know until I started researching for this Pset, if you're vaccinated and you get infected, you actually have a reduced chance of transmitting that virus. So I've implemented that here by creating a new constant called C infectiousness vaccinated. So it's lower than the traditional infectious constant. Now, the third and final, and arguably the most important for our simulation, defining characteristic is a decreased severity of symptoms. So in the real world, if you get vaccinated and you contract the disease, the severity of your symptoms tend to be a lot lower. And I've implemented that right here. This portion of the code calculates the mortality rate, or calculates whether this person that is infected is going to die. And this line in particular, or this constant, it's a new constant that I've added, and it makes it so that it's half of what the normal mortality rate is. So you'll see that people that have been vaccinated and later contract the disease, they have a lower mortality rate. So let me run this program and you'll see, again, to remind you, light blue is people that have been vaccinated but don't have the disease. The green color is people that were vaccinated and still contracted the disease. And you can see the data right here. And I've amalgamated all of it down here. The main thing you want to compare it to is the normal data, the one without any extensions. And you'll see when we just ran the code with no extensions, 104 people ended up dying. But in this vaccinated case, which again, not everyone is getting vaccinated, you can see the light blue portion, it's maybe 15 to 20%. But that's still reduced the deaths. And now we're only at 74 deaths as opposed to 104. That's a pretty good impact. And you'll see right here, the total number of infected people, because it's split into two categories, infected people and infected people that got vaccinated, is 212. You compare that over here, which I believe it's at 275. So you can see we're making inroads on the number of infected people as well. So you could see that in the real world and in my simulation, the vaccine not only helps reduce transmissions, but it also helps decrease the mortality rate. And that is consistent with real world data. Also, when I submit this Pset, I'm gonna comment out all of my extensions. It'll still be there, but just for the sake of the unit test, I'm not entirely sure how it works. I don't want my extensions to penalize me. So all the code is there, it's just commented out. It's in its proper position, but yeah, thank you for watching.